For Victims and Villains, my name is Josh, and today we are talking about the movie Imaginary. As I was saying, today we are talking about the movie Imaginary from Jeff Wadlow, the latest offering from the director of Truth or Dare or Fantasy Island, and it depicts the story of a family that moves into the stepmom's childhood home only to have some really unusual things happen linked to trauma and imaginary friends and kind of how the two shall meet. Let me just start off by saying that Jeff Wadlow as a director, I have a love-hate relationship with him. I loathed Truth or Dare. I thought it was one of the worst horror movies that we have gotten in the last 10 years. And then on the flip side of that, I had a blast with Fantasy Island. I know everyone complains about that movie. I had a fun time with it. I think it's one of those movies that's just campy enough to just be fun and dumb and to just kind of just hang out and throw on and just be brain dead to. Coming into this movie, I had no expectations. I knew nothing about it. I didn't even know Jeff Wadlow directed it until his name came up on the opening screen. And I really hoped that we were going to get a modernized, kind of campy, Chucky-like movie. It's anything but. The only good thing about this movie is Imaginary, both literally and figuratively speaking. This movie just was absolutely boring, and it literally took so many cues from other horror movies that did a premise like this and made it better. Do you remember a movie that released during the pandemic called Separation? Yeah, it's streaming on Peacock. Not a lot of people remember it, and this movie feels almost beat for beat like that movie. This movie takes what I would call homages to other horror franchises, though it feels like outright theft. And when I say that, I mean it is taken from A Nightmare on Elm Street, Stephen King's It, Hellraiser, Stranger Things. The entire third act of this movie feels like a condensed version of Hellraiser 2. Every character in this movie, with the exception of DeWanda Wise, who is the only performance worth talking about in this movie, feels very one note, or they feel like they are just a vehicle for exposition. So many characters that if you kind of picked them out of this movie, the movie would relatively remain the same. You could literally, there's like maybe one or two ties that they actually have to the narrative, and you could easily just copy and paste that to another character and make this world feel a lot more fulfilling and a lot more satisfying and a lot more just well-rounded than what it currently is. I compared this movie to Separation earlier, and the reason that I made that comparison is because Separation had a really cool, similar imaginary friend concept, but it never actually outright showed you the character design. It always hid it behind shadows. It was such a badass design. And they really take that here, where it's the same exact approach, where you're kind of only seeing it very so lightly, and there's a lot of darkness surrounding it. And even when they finally do give the full quote-unquote reveal of the monster, it is so dark you can barely make it out. The thing that makes me really sad about Imaginary is that this film had potential, and it feels like it just squandered it. Like, had this movie kind of opened up Pandora's box, and we had spent not just the third act, but the second and third act in the imaginary world, I think this movie could have largely been a better product. Maybe it might not have been a stand-up great film that we would be talking about for years to come, but it definitely could have been a cult classic in the making. And instead, this movie feels like it's unsure of itself because it doesn't have a tone that it sticks to. There are some moments where this film feels like just a traditional drama, and then there are these moments where it's trying to really embrace these supernatural elements and fantastical bits, and it kind of just feels like a hodgepodge of things just kind of squandered together. I talked earlier about how it like kind of steals from all these other horror franchises, the fact that it can't just stick to one and again proves that point about this film just being a messy execution. I feel like the third act of this movie, where we actually do get to the quote unquote other side, just felt like a wasted potential again, because there's so much interesting things about the lore that's created in the mythos that Wadlow and company have carved out here. And I think that this movie could have had so much potential. It just makes me so sad. One of the things that I will say, as a mental health publication, I do think that this film kind of takes the same approach to storytelling that something like the Babadook does, where it is using a monster to kind of talk about grief. In this case, it's talking specifically about repressed memories and kind of traumatic childhoods, and kind of using that as a metaphor. I think this film does that really well, but it never sticks to one idea. All in all, this may end up being one of the worst movies of the year, and I'm ready to run this through the Rorschach rating scale. I'm going to go ahead and give Imaginary a 1.5 out of 5. This movie has so much potential, and it literally just burnt it to the ground and then decided to pee on the ashes to ruin any chance of redemption. This movie feels really unsure of what it wants to do. Does it want to be a drama? Does it want to address a metaphor, be a creature feature that is addressing things like repressed memories, childhood trauma, and kind of presenting those to the audience? But rather, instead, it's just kind of presented as this messy, here you go kind of thing. If you guys have seen Imaginary, what did you guys think about it? Comment below and let me know. But let's talk about mental health. If you guys are new to our content, Mental Health Moment is where we will take a theme of mental health out of the film, which we're talking about, expand upon it for a few moments in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. As I've mentioned, this film does deal really heavily with mental health, and I think that's one of the things that this movie gets right. How it executes them is a completely different story, but I digress. There's a moment in here where Wise's character is talking to one of her stepdaughters, and she's kind of explaining the fact that scars are a part of our story and the importance of scars. I think sometimes when it comes to our own mental health stories, we have this tendency to overlook the scars and the things that we've gone through in the past. And we fail to realize that sometimes that they can be things of beauty and things of grace and stepping stones for other people later in their own stories. But that journey of coming to that mentality of scars are beautiful is a work in progress, and really does take a lot of time to ultimately reach that conclusion. And sometimes things like therapy, counseling, hotlines, warm lines, a lot of the resources that you'll find in our mental health resource library, links are in the show notes below, by the way, really are the first great steps in order to bring about healing. So if you or someone you know is struggling, we would greatly ask you to consider the mental health resources below. And that's going to do it for us talking about Imaginary and mental health today. So hit that subscribe button below, and until next time, remember, keep it classy, keep it scary.